There was no national broadcast, no grand announcement, no press release echoing through the news cycles. Just one quiet phrase, spoken during a low-profile diplomatic update, shifted the political weight of an entire region. There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso. These 6 words, casually delivered by the ECOWAS chairman, stunned everyone who had been watching the Sahel. Because just a year ago, Burkina Faso was being sanctioned, isolated, and condemned by the same man. Now a shift had occurred, subtle, but monumental. It didn't happen in a palace or summit. It happened in a dull meeting room filled with diplomats who didn't expect anything new. But they heard something that changed everything. Not a policy reversal, not a change of tone, a reluctant truth, a reality too visible to ignore. For months, ECOWAS had hoped silence would buy time. They expected the breakaway nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, to collapse under pressure. Instead, something else unfolded. These countries didn't retreat into rebellion. They rebuilt, they coordinated. And slowly, they started to function. What unsettled ECOWAS wasn't just Traoré's defiance. It was the results he delivered. Roads appeared where none had existed. Markets reopened without foreign supervision. Children returned to classrooms in zones once labeled ungovernable. And now, even those who once dismissed this leadership style are being forced to look again. Because if the chairman of ECOWAS, a symbol of the status quo, is breaking his silence, then something deeper must be happening beneath the surface. And so we ask the real question: why now? What did he see that made the most loyal guardian of West African order suddenly speak up? Was it admiration or anxiety? Progress or pressure? This is not just a diplomatic update. It's the first crack in a wall that was never meant to break. And the next moves may decide not only Burkina Faso's future, but West Africa's place in the world. The moment passed quietly, but the shockwaves came later. In the middle of a routine ECOWAS press briefing, with eyes barely paying attention and pens moving lazily, the chairman uttered a phrase that changed everything. There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso. It was not a concession speech, not a turning point by design, yet the impact was unmistakable. For months, ECOWAS had maintained a posture of icy detachment, refusing to acknowledge the governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as anything more than temporary disruptions. They enforced sanctions, suspended funding, and spoke with the authority of a bloc that once saw itself as the backbone of regional order. But something changed. When the chairman returned from a technical inspection in Burkina Faso, those around him noticed he was different. He didn't speak immediately, but when he finally did, it wasn't with grand words or political theater. It was with weary honesty, and those 6 words, calm, measured, unscripted, rattled through West African diplomacy like a fault line splitting beneath the surface. His trip had shown him something no report had captured. He had walked streets once thought abandoned to militants and found functioning infrastructure. In Gawa, he visited a refinery where Burkinabè engineers processed raw gold into certified bars, something the country had never done under foreign supervision. In Jibo, he stepped into a classroom where children studied beneath a handmade banner that read, "We don't wait to be saved. We learn to save ourselves." The meaning was unmistakable. This was not a country begging for forgiveness. This was a government that had rejected the need to be rescued at all. The chairman saw villages once considered lawless, now patrolled by barefoot youths, trained not to kill, but to wire electricity poles for their towns. He saw farmers led by local women growing enough grain to supply multiple provinces without international funding. No IMF briefings, no World Bank missions, no UN tents, just Burkinabè doing the work. What shook him wasn't the presence of development. It was the absence of dependency. Across the Sahel, what ECOWAS once labeled fragile was becoming functional. In the streets of Ouagadougou, markets reopened without foreign food aid. In regions long marked as red zones, solar grids powered homes and clinics. In places where children once fled from gunfire, they now ran toward playgrounds. The model didn't just challenge ECOWAS, it exposed it. Because nothing Traoré had achieved came from permission. It came from refusal. Refusal to wait, refusal to explain, refusal to bow. And slowly, that refusal turned into something else. Results. The sanctions didn't starve Burkina Faso. They pushed it inward, forced it to grow. And the more it grew, the more ECOWAS looked like a voice shouting into an empty room. Flights resumed across borders under technical exemptions. Informal trade routes flourished with local coordination. Military alliances strengthened between the Sahel states while ECOWAS watched from the sidelines. Their tools no longer worked. Their threats no longer mattered. And now, their silence had finally cracked. The chairman's visit confirmed what many inside the bloc had whispered in corridors for months. Burkina Faso hadn't collapsed. It had rebuilt. And worse for ECOWAS, it had done so in full view of other member states who were starting to ask dangerous questions. What if defiance leads to stability? What if aid dependency is the real threat to sovereignty? What if Traoré is not an exception, but a beginning? The chairman never answered those questions aloud. He didn't have to. His face said enough. The quiet sentence he spoke had echoed louder than any summit. Because in a system built on consensus, even one broken silence can change everything. By the time the chairman's words reached other ECOWAS capitals, the narrative had already begun to shift. His remark wasn't treated like a diplomatic courtesy. It was dissected like a political tremor. Inside Abuja, Accra, and Dakar, foreign ministries scrambled to interpret the implications. Was this the start of a policy reversal or simply a man speaking out of line? Either answer was dangerous. Because if it was personal, then the chairman had broken the uniformity ECOWAS relies on. And if it was strategic, then the entire architecture of ECOWAS consensus was shaking. Within days, media outlets picked up the phrase. Analysts weighed in. Some praised the honesty. Others warned of creeping legitimization. But the ground was already moving faster than they could frame it. Traoré's silence only amplified the message. He issued no statement. He called no press conference. His government treated the chairman's words not as news but as confirmation. For them, the world was simply catching up. In the streets of Ouagadougou, citizens responded with quiet pride. Flags waved a little higher. Markets buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. Radio hosts spoke of the shift not as a surprise but as justice, long delayed. Yet inside ECOWAS, unease spread like wildfire. The tools that once enforced order, sanctions, isolation, political pressure, had lost their bite. Worse still, Traoré wasn't asking to return. He wasn't even acknowledging the door. He had walked away from the table and built another. And now, others were starting to look in his direction. Behind closed doors, meetings grew tense. Senior officials in member states began voicing concerns they once buried. What if the AES bloc wasn't just a protest but a prototype? What if military governance under Traoré's model proved more efficient than the donor-reliant civilian regimes ECOWAS had long protected? What if young populations, tired of economic stagnation and foreign dictates, began demanding the same model back home? The fear wasn't ideological. It was existential. Because if the old rules no longer apply, then the old rulers lose their relevance. That's why the chairman's words were not a slip. They were a signal. A quiet flare to the remaining ECOWAS leaders that the center could no longer hold. The alliance ECOWAS tried to sideline, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, was no longer in protest mode. It was building schools, running power lines, launching local industries. It was forming military pacts independent of French command, exploring currency systems outside the CFA, and securing investment deals that didn't require political obedience. In that context, even a whisper of praise becomes a diplomatic earthquake, because it forces everyone else to choose. Either repeat the silence and look disconnected, or echo the statement and risk a domino effect. That's why the chairman's visit had been so closely guarded. It wasn't just about what he would say, it was about what he would see. and whether that vision would become contagious. And what he saw couldn't be unseen. In every village he visited, the signs of self-determination were not hidden. They were everywhere. Children learning under solar-powered roofs. Gold being refined by local engineers. Crops harvested without donor targets. Soldiers repurposed as builders and teachers. In one community, a mayor explained how electricity poles were installed by barefoot trainees with no previous experience, guided only by local veterans and technical manuals printed in Mossy. Another showed him water systems fed by handmade piping sourced from scrap metal. Across the Sahel, he encountered workshops where blacksmiths forged their own tools and bakeries running on wood-fired stoves that powered an entire village economy. What Traoré had done wasn't radical by design. It was radical by results. And that's the twist ECOWAS hadn't predicted. They expected a spectacle, a military parade, a man hungry for headlines. What they got was far more dangerous. Quiet competence, efficient systems, progress without permission, and that's why the chairman spoke. Not to compliment Traoré, but to brace his peers, to warn them, without saying the word, that the narrative had changed, and that if they didn't adjust soon, they might find themselves left behind not by rebels but by results. Because in today's West Africa, power no longer belongs to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one laying bricks, feeding villages, and turning promises into infrastructure. The moment the ECOWAS chairman spoke those 6 words, the region began recalibrating itself. Not in policy papers or summit declarations, but in the hearts and behaviors of ordinary people and government officials alike. The phrase echoed far beyond conference rooms. It reached border checkpoints, military academies, radio stations, and village clinics. In Mali and Niger, local leaders used the statement as quiet validation. They weren't isolated anymore. They were part of a rising alternative with proof behind it. For families in border towns, it meant safer roads. For merchants, it meant fewer inspections and faster routes through once-closed trade corridors. What was once seen as disobedience was now quietly recognized as resilience. In Burkina Faso, the shift wasn't celebrated with parades. It was absorbed in motion. Construction crews expanded village power grids using military trucks once meant for war. Former combat zones now held literacy classes under tarpaulin roofs with wooden benches made by local carpenters. National radio replaced recycled Western pop songs with interviews from young engineers describing how they built solar pumps from repurposed scrap. The youth who had once fled to coastal cities for opportunity now returned to towns that had found their footing without donors. Farmers started rejecting contracts that demanded pricing dictated from abroad. Mayors met without waiting for instructions from embassies. School teachers spoke in local dialects instead of French bureaucratic terms, and students carried notebooks stamped not with NGO logos, but with the country's own rising star. Politically, the impact ran deeper than any headline could convey. Inside parliaments of neighboring states, dissenting voices grew bolder. Why are we punishing those who provide for their people? Why are we defending a regional order that can't fix its own roads or feed its own cities? These questions were once whispered. Now they found microphones. And those microphones reached the ears of presidents who could no longer pretend they weren't listening. ECOWAS, designed to enforce unity, was now watching its legitimacy splinter, not from rebellion, but from replication. Local administrators began replicating Burkina Faso's agricultural co-op model. Military schools copied its civilian training programs. Ministers from outside the Sahel secretly requested policy blueprints through back channels. Even those still critical of military governance had to admit that the numbers were shifting. Inflation slowed. Markets recovered. Public trust returned not to personalities, but to public services. The greatest threat Traoré posed was not ideological. It was administrative. He had shown that dignity could become daily life, not a slogan, not a speech, but a working model. That shook the old guard more than any uprising. In Ghana, a former ECOWAS advisor admitted off-record that the chairman's words opened a door that might not close again. In Senegal, Youth leaders staged debates on alternative sovereignty models. In the Gambia, journalists stopped referring to Burkina Faso as a failed state. Even the language of diplomacy changed. Progress was no longer framed as conditional. It was observed as undeniable. Across West Africa, artists painted murals of local children studying under candlelight beside satellite dishes built from broken metal drums. Graffiti in Lagos read, "We build with what they left behind." In Niamey, a civil servant held a seminar on how to design procurement laws that exclude dependency clauses. These were not coordinated movements. They were reflections of a deeper transformation, a psychological shift from waiting for rescue to designing reality. Meanwhile, the Sahel Alliance took notice. Meetings once held in secrecy now issued joint statements. Proposals once seen as radical, regional railway plans, mutual food reserves, joint border patrols, became the new normal. The idea of waiting for ECOWAS approval dissolved. No more permission, only preparation. Burkina Faso wasn't just reforming itself, it was altering the framework of legitimacy for the entire region. And the people felt it. Grandmothers who had survived droughts now helped plant community gardens. Former rebels became irrigation technicians. Imams gave Friday sermons about self-reliance drawn from local scripture. A new vocabulary emerged across markets and mosques. Sovereignty not as separation, but as self-definition. The flags waving across the Sahel no longer asked to be accepted. They announced arrival. And all of this, every clinic opened, every road paved, every child back in school, carried a silent weight, not as rebellion, but as evidence. And evidence once seen cannot be denied. For months, the West had treated Burkina Faso as an anomaly, a temporary flare-up of anti-French sentiment, a military detour on the road back to donor-driven normalcy. American think tanks published white papers warning about regional instability and Russian influence, while European media framed Traoré as another strongman seizing power through populism. But something shifted after the ECOWAS chairman broke his silence. In Washington, analysts began asking quieter questions. Why hadn't Burkina Faso collapsed? Why were sanctions not working? And more importantly, why were neighboring populations admiring the results instead of condemning the process? The usual narrative, that sovereignty without Western partnership leads to failure, was being quietly undermined. At the State Department, private briefings grew more cautious. Language once filled with condemnation softened into conditional observation. Phrases like unexpected stability and emerging local governance models began to appear in policy memos. Across the Atlantic, Brussels took a similar turn. EU officials avoided direct comment on Traoré, but trade envoys were instructed to monitor gold markets and energy projects in the Sahel more closely. Diplomats privately admitted they were surprised, not just by Burkina Faso's endurance, but by its initiative. The fear was no longer about coups, it was about credibility. What if this model, built without permission, began to influence reformist politicians in Francophone Africa? What if the AES alliance deepened ties with China or Russia, not out of ideology, but necessity? What if regional blocs led by Western partners found themselves outpaced by grassroots cooperation, native currencies, and infrastructure built without a single European blueprint? In newsrooms from Paris to New York, the tone began to shift. Traoré was no longer just a name associated with rebellion. He was now linked with images of functioning clinics, local schools, and gold refineries run by young engineers. While opinion pieces still questioned the lack of elections, they could no longer ignore the results. Burkina Faso was not asking to be admired. It was asking to be understood. And that made global powers uncomfortable. Because if success is measured by outcomes rather than alignment, then the West no longer sets the terms. In that recalibration, the world saw something they did not predict. A model of sovereignty that didn't seek permission and yet remained surprisingly effective. Burkina Faso was never supposed to rise this way. It was meant to bend under sanctions, falter without aid, and eventually return to the familiar order of dependency and controlled reform. But it didn't. And now the silence is broken. Across West Africa, from Accra to Bamako, leaders are recalculating. They have seen what the chairman saw, not a rebellion in flames, but a society rebuilding brick by brick. They saw clinics standing where tents once collapsed, gold sealed into national reserves instead of smuggled across borders, and students studying under their own flag, not one borrowed from international partners. For those who once dismissed the Sahel as lost, these images are difficult to process. And for those who never stopped watching, they confirm something more powerful. That dignity, once declared, can be made functional. That sovereignty is not a speech. It is a school that opens. It is a light that stays on at night. It is a woman who no longer walks 10 kilometers for water. Traoré's government never asked for applause. But by forcing the world to look, they revealed how much of African potential has been held back by the need for permission. And now, the question is no longer whether this model works. The question is what comes next. Will other nations follow, not in form, but in principle? Will communities elsewhere dare to build without waiting for consensus? And how long can the old order pretend not to hear the hum of progress rising from the places they left behind? In the end, the chairman's words will not be remembered for how softly they were spoken, but for what they signaled. That something has shifted in the fabric of West African politics. A new table is being built. And those who want to sit at it must bring more than speeches. They must bring outcomes. Because this is no longer about rebellion. It is about redefining success. If you believe that sovereignty must mean something more than a seat at someone else's summit, share this story. And if you believe dignity should be measurable, not theoretical, subscribe and stay connected. The road ahead will not be easy, but for the first time in a long time, it is being paved by those who no longer bow.